At dawn on June 6, 1944, the first landing craft reached the Normandy shoreline according to an approved timetable. At 6:30 local time, the forward ramps were lowered simultaneously across several sectors of the coast. Records indicate that within the first minutes of landing, certain units lost more than half of their personnel without advancing more than 10 meters beyond the waterline. Some companies ceased to exist as organized formations before leaving the tidal zone. At the same time, portions of the coastal defenses listed as destroyed following preliminary bombardment continued to deliver aimed fire. Observers aboard naval vessels reported active firing positions in sectors marked as neutralized. Radio reports from the beaches arrived intermittently or did not arrive at all. Planned signals were not confirmed. Visual reference points disappeared in smoke, water, and sand. Simultaneously, German headquarters received reports from other directions that did not correspond to events on the coast. The radio spectrum remained saturated with signals indicating preparations for a landing in an entirely different area. Portions of the reserve forces remained in place. On the shore, personnel exited landing craft under fire without knowing who was nearby, who had been killed, or who was still moving. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, naval forces assembled in the English Channel under orders issued during the preceding weeks. The movement followed schedules circulated through sealed operational directives. Convoys departed from ports along the southern coast of England, including Portsmouth, Southampton, Weymouth, and Plymouth. Vessels included assault transports, landing ships, destroyers, minesweepers, and support craft. Minesweeping operations had commenced during the night along designated lanes. Weather conditions included low cloud cover, intermittent wind, and moderate seas. Reports from meteorological units were transmitted through command channels shortly before departure, indicating a narrow interval of acceptable conditions. Naval formations proceeded toward the French coast under radio silence, guided by prearranged navigation plans, visual signals, and radar bearings. The assault force was divided into sectors aligned with assigned beaches along the Normandy coast. Each sector corresponded to a codename and a designated landing schedule. Timetables specified each hour for infantry landings, followed by armor and additional units. Aerial operations were conducted simultaneously. Transport aircraft crossed the channel carrying airborne units assigned to drop zones inland. Glider formations followed in later waves. Naval gunfire support units took assigned positions offshore to deliver preparatory bombardments. On the French side, German forces maintained coastal defenses under the authority of Army Group B. Defensive arrangements consisted of infantry divisions deployed along the shoreline, supported by artillery batteries, machine gun emplacements, obstacles, and fortified positions. Beach obstacles included wooden stakes, steel hedgehogs, ramps, and mine structures placed to impede landing craft at varying tidal levels. Many obstacles were equipped with explosive charges. Observation posts were positioned along the coast, connected by telephone lines to command centers. Orders required immediate reporting of naval activity. At approximately midnight, German radar installations along the Channel coast detected aerial activity. Reports indicated multiple contacts approaching from the west and northwest. Anti-aircraft units engaged aircraft over coastal regions. Paratroopers began descending into designated zones, encountering dispersed conditions due to navigation errors, wind drift, and defensive fire. Engagements occurred between airborne units and German security forces, including patrols and reserve formations. Communications disruptions were reported in several German sectors due to damaged lines and confusion regarding the scale of the drops. Naval bombardment commenced according to schedule in the early morning hours. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fired upon identified coastal targets. Fire plans had been prepared based on aerial reconnaissance, intelligence reports, and photographic analysis. The bombardment aimed at gun emplacements, bunkers, and strongpoints overlooking the beaches. Smoke and dust rose along the coastline. Some German positions were hit, while others remained operational due to construction depth, camouflage, or dispersion. As the assault waves approached the beaches, landing craft formed lines several miles offshore. Troops transferred from larger transports into smaller craft during the night. Equipment loads included weapons, ammunition, demolition charges, radios, and supplies. Many soldiers carried additional weight beyond standard loads. Sea conditions caused craft to pitch and roll. Instances of seasickness were reported. Officers and non-commissioned officers conducted final checks according to standing procedures. At each hour, the first assault waves advanced toward the shore. Naval gunfire lifted according to schedule to avoid striking friendly forces. Aircraft conducted bombing runs against inland targets and coastal defenses. In several sectors, bomb release points were adjusted due to cloud cover and concerns about short bombing. As a result, some ordnance fell beyond intended targets. When landing craft reached shallow water, ramps were lowered under fire from shore-based weapons. German machine guns, rifles, mortars, and artillery engaged the approaching craft and disembarking troops. Fire was directed from prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire. In multiple locations, units disembarked into water deeper than expected due to tidal conditions and navigation errors. Soldiers carrying heavy equipment submerged upon exit. Some were unable to regain footing. Casualties occurred immediately upon disembarkation. Records note men struck by fire while on ramps, in the water, or upon reaching obstacles. Medical personnel reported difficulty reaching the wounded under sustained fire. Engineers assigned to clear obstacles encountered mines and explosive devices. Demolition charges were placed according to training, but progress was slowed by casualties and disrupted formations. On certain beaches, strongpoints remained active despite bombardment. Concrete emplacements with narrow firing slits continued to engage the shoreline. Fields of fire covered open sand and obstacle gaps. Units attempting to advance inland encountered wire entanglements and minefields. Communication between assault elements was limited due to damaged radios and the loss of leaders. Naval units offshore observed the intensity of fire and adjusted positions. Destroyers moved closer to shore to engage visible targets with direct fire. Spotters directed fire against identified emplacements. Some gun positions were silenced after repeated hits. Others ceased fire temporarily and resumed later. German defensive responses followed standing orders. Local commanders reported landings to higher headquarters. Requests for armored support were transmitted. Reserve units awaited authorization to move, pending confirmation of the main landing area. Road movement was affected by airborne activity inland, damaged bridges, and traffic congestion. In the air, Allied aircraft maintained patrols and strike missions. Fighter cover operated over the beaches and inland approaches. German air response was limited during the early hours, with scattered sorties reported. Anti-aircraft fire continued from coastal and inland positions. By mid-morning, assault units that had survived the initial landings began to organize under cover where available. Small groups advanced using terrain features such as shingle banks, dunes, and embankments. Engineers worked to clear lanes through obstacles. Medical stations were established in exposed positions. Casualty evacuation was conducted by landing craft returning to transports. The scale of losses during the initial minutes was recorded in unit logs, medical reports, and after-action messages transmitted during pauses in fighting. Losses included killed, wounded, and missing. Equipment losses were also reported, including radios, weapons, and vehicles destroyed before reaching shore. Simultaneously with the landings, deceptive measures remained in effect across other regions. Radio traffic associated with notional formations continued according to prearranged schedules. Dummy installations, including inflatable tanks and aircraft, remained deployed in southeastern England. Double agents transmitted reports consistent with earlier patterns. Messages suggested continued preparation for landings in areas other than Normandy. German intelligence channels received and processed this information alongside fragmented reports from the coast. German command structures evaluated incoming reports during the morning hours. Information from Normandy was weighed against existing assessments of likely landing sites. Weather conditions in other regions were considered. Some formations remained in place awaiting further confirmation. Movement orders were issued incrementally. Along the Normandy coast, fighting continued throughout the day as additional waves landed. The initial minutes had passed into sustained engagements, but the records of those first moments remained fixed in reports written during lulls and transmitted under fire. These records documented timings, locations, unit strengths, and observed conditions without reference to outcomes beyond the immediate situation. The deception measures that preceded the landings had been implemented over months through coordinated efforts involving operational planning, intelligence, and communications control. In the hours of the assault, those measures remained active, continuing to generate signals and reports aligned with established patterns. German monitoring stations intercepted radio transmissions consistent with earlier activity. Reconnaissance flights observed static installations in expected areas. In Normandy, the situation evolved minute by minute as units attempted to gain footholds. Naval gunfire continued intermittently. Smoke screens were deployed. Reinforcements arrived according to schedule or with delays due to beach conditions and enemy fire. The initial casualties remained where they had fallen until they could be reached. Throughout the morning, reports were compiled and forwarded through command channels on both sides. These reports reflected the immediate circumstances as observed by those present. They contained no summaries beyond the current status and no projections beyond the next ordered action. The events of the first minutes were recorded as sequences of landings, engagements, and losses, forming part of the operational record of that day. As the morning hours progressed along the Normandy coastline, additional assault waves continued to approach the designated landing areas according to naval timetables issued prior to departure. Landing craft formed up offshore under control vessels that relayed visual signals. Smoke from naval gunfire and burning equipment reduced visibility near the shore. Tidal conditions altered the exposure of obstacles, uncovering additional mines and steel structures not visible during earlier waves. Engineers adjusted procedures under fire, marking cleared lanes where possible using poles, tape, or flags when materials were available. Infantry units that had reached the shingle bank or seawall attempted to reorganize based on fragmentary orders. Commanders relied on hand signals and runners where radios were inoperable or lost. Platoons and companies operated at reduced strength due to casualties sustained during approach and landing. Weapon crews assembled remaining machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons when components had survived the transit. Ammunition stocks were redistributed among surviving personnel. German defensive fire continued from positions that remained intact. Machine gun teams shifted barrels and ammunition belts as required. Mortar sections adjusted fire based on observed movement on the beaches. Artillery batteries inland fired according to pre-arranged defensive plans, targeting beach exits and suspected assembly areas. Observation posts relayed corrections when lines remained functional. In some sectors, naval gunfire had damaged communications, forcing reliance on runners or flares. Movement inland was constrained by terrain and prepared obstacles. Exits from the beaches were limited to draws, roads, and paths that had been mapped in advance by Allied planners and fortified by German engineers. These exits were covered by interlocking fire from bunkers and trenches positioned on higher ground. Assault teams employed grenades, rifle fire, and demolitions to neutralize individual positions when was possible. Progress occurred unevenly across sectors, with some groups halted for extended periods under fire. Medical personnel operated under conditions defined by exposure and shortage of supplies. Aid stations were established in shallow depressions, behind obstacles, or against embankments. Wounded personnel were treated where they lay when evacuation was not immediately possible. Stretchers were scarce, and improvised carrying methods were used. Landing craft returning to transports carried wounded when space allowed, often under continued fire. Naval units offshore maintained assigned stations while responding to requests from shore parties when communications permitted. Destroyers closed to short range to engage visible targets on bluffs and headlands. Gunnery officers selected targets based on direct observation and reports from forward observers. Shellfire impacted defensive positions, collapsing parapets and disrupting firing ports in some cases. Adjustments were made continuously to avoid friendly positions as assault units advanced beyond initial lines. Inland, airborne units continued operations initiated during the night. Paratroopers assembled in small groups based on available personnel and objectives known from briefing materials. Engagements occurred with German units conducting security and counterdrop actions. Road junctions, bridges, and communication lines were contested. Reports from these actions were transmitted intermittently when radio contact could be established. German command elements at regimental and divisional levels processed reports from coastal units indicating landings in progress. Estimates of enemy strength varied widely due to limited observation and disrupted communications. Requests for reinforcement were submitted through established channels. Some reserve units began preparatory movement, while others remained in place awaiting confirmation and authorization. Air reconnaissance was requested but constrained by weather and Allied air activity. Throughout the morning, deception-related radio traffic originating from England continued according to established schedules. Signals units transmitted messages consistent with prior patterns associated with formations not involved in the Normandy landings. These transmissions adhered to security protocols designed to mirror normal operational communications. German interception units logged this traffic alongside incoming reports from the coast. On the beaches, armor elements began landing when conditions permitted. Amphibious tanks launched offshore encountered mechanical difficulties and sea conditions that affected buoyancy and navigation. Some tanks reached shore and engaged targets directly. Others failed to arrive, leaving infantry without immediate armored support in certain sectors. Engineers worked to clear paths for vehicles through obstacles and soft sand. Beachmasters and naval shore parties attempted to impose order on congested landing zones. Signals were used to direct incoming craft to designated lanes. Wrecked vehicles, damaged landing craft, and casualties obstructed movement. Tidal changes shifted debris and submerged hazards, complicating subsequent landings. Logistical units began unloading supplies under fire, prioritizing ammunition, medical stores, and engineering equipment. German defenders conducted local counterattacks when conditions allowed. Small unit movements sought to exploit gaps or disorganized assault elements. These actions were coordinated within the limits of available communication and observation. Firefights occurred at close range near beach exits and defensive positions. Casualties were sustained on both sides during these engagements. Naval and air support remained active throughout the day. Fighter aircraft patrolled overhead, engaging targets of opportunity and providing limited close support when requested. Bombing missions continued against transportation routes and known strongpoints inland. Anti-aircraft fire persisted from German positions, though its intensity varied by sector and time. By late morning and early afternoon, footholds inland had been established in some areas, while other sectors remained contested near the shoreline. The initial landings had transitioned into prolonged engagements characterized by incremental advances and localized actions. The first minutes of the assault, recorded in logs and reports, remained the point of reference for casualty figures and unit status updates transmitted throughout the day. German Higher Command continued to assess the situation based on incomplete and sometimes conflicting information. Reports from Normandy indicated substantial enemy presence, while intelligence from other regions suggested continued activity consistent with earlier expectations. Reserve formations were alerted or repositioned according to standing plans, with movement constrained by air interdiction and airborne activity. Deception measures remained active beyond the initial hours. Dummy formations, false radio networks, and controlled agent reports continued to generate indicators aligned with prior assessments. German intelligence processing incorporated these indicators alongside real-time combat reports, producing a mixed operational picture. On the ground in Normandy, assault units consolidated positions as opportunities arose. Defensive perimeters were established around captured terrain features. Engineers cleared additional routes for movement. Artillery units began landing components and establishing firing positions when space and conditions permitted. Communication networks were gradually restored using field wire and repaired radios. Casualty reporting continued as units accounted for personnel and equipment. Numbers were transmitted upward without commentary, reflecting counts of killed, wounded, missing, and effective strength remaining. Medical evacuation continued throughout the day as sea conditions and enemy fire allowed. The operational record of these hours consisted of situation reports, fire mission logs, naval action reports, and intelligence summaries. Each document reflected observations made at specific times under prevailing conditions. The events of the first minutes, when assault waves met concentrated defensive fire, remain documented as sequences of actions and losses within these records, forming part of the ongoing operational narrative as the day progressed. During the afternoon hours of June 6, 1944, the situation along the Normandy coast remained fluid across all assault sectors. Landing operations continued under revised schedules as naval commanders adjusted to congestion, damage, and changing tidal conditions. Control vessels relayed altered instructions using flags, lamps, and loudhailers where possible. Some landing craft were diverted to secondary beaches or delayed offshore while cleared lanes were reopened. The accumulation of wrecked craft, vehicles, and equipment along the shoreline constrained movement and reduced usable landing space. Infantry units ashore continued efforts to expand narrow lodgements beyond the immediate beach areas. Movement inland occurred in small increments as resistance was reduced position by position. German defensive works included trenches, dugouts, and interconnected strongpoints constructed to allow mutual support. Assault teams employed available weapons to suppress and neutralize these positions. Progress depended on local conditions, availability of ammunition, and coordination between infantry, engineers, and supporting fire. Naval gunfire support remained a primary means of engaging targets beyond the range of infantry weapons. Forward observers ashore attempted to direct fire using radios or visual signals. Where communication was established, fire missions were requested against specific coordinates or identifiable features. Destroyers and cruisers responded within the limits of ammunition supply and safety constraints. Some ships reported expending significant portions of their main battery ammunition during these engagements. German artillery units continued firing missions against beachheads and approach routes. Batteries repositioned when possible to avoid counter-battery fire. Ammunition expenditure was recorded in battery logs. In some sectors, supply difficulties limited sustained fire. Air observation for artillery was sporadic due to Allied air activity and weather conditions. Ground observers adjusted fire based on sound and limited visibility. The arrival of follow-on forces proceeded throughout the afternoon. Additional infantry, armor, and support units landed as space permitted. Vehicles were unloaded using ramps or cranes, then guided off beaches along cleared routes. Engineers reinforced exits with temporary roadways, filled craters, and removed obstacles to facilitate movement. Traffic control points were established to manage flow inland, though congestion remained common. Medical evacuation increased in volume as casualty clearing stations ashore became operational. Wounded personnel were moved from aid stations to evacuation points near the waterline. Landing craft assigned to casualty evacuation departed under escort when necessary. Medical logs recorded treatments administered and numbers evacuated. Supplies of plasma, bandages, and morphine were replenished as shipments arrived. Inland engagements continued between airborne units and German formations. Paratroopers consolidated control over selected road junctions and bridges where possible. German countermeasures included patrols, localized attacks, and efforts to re-establish communications. Reports from these actions were transmitted intermittently, often delayed by damaged equipment or movement under fire. German higher headquarters issued orders based on accumulated reports. Some reserve units began moving toward Normandy, subject to authorization and transport availability. Movement was conducted primarily at night or under cover due to Allied air presence. Rail lines and road networks were subjected to air attacks, causing delays and rerouting. Unit diaries recorded departure times, routes, and interruptions. Throughout the afternoon, Allied air operations maintained pressure on transportation and communication targets inland. Fighter bombers attacked vehicles, rail yards, and troop concentrations when identified. Air cover over the beaches remained active, though sorties rotated to maintain fuel and ammunition requirements. Anti-aircraft fire continued from German positions, with varying effectiveness. Deception operations persisted without interruption. Radio transmissions from notional units continued according to established schedules. Signals traffic simulated preparations, requests, and routine communications associated with formations not engaged in Normandy. Double agents transmitted reports consistent with earlier narratives. These actions were conducted under centralized control to maintain consistency. German intelligence elements processed intercepted communications alongside field reports. Assessments varied by command level and location. Some reports emphasized activity in Normandy, while others noted continued indications elsewhere. Decision-making reflected these inputs within existing command frameworks. Orders emphasized readiness and adherence to established defensive plans. On the beaches, logistical operations expanded as supply dumps were established beyond immediate landing zones. Ammunition, fuel, rations, and engineering materials were stockpiled where space allowed. Shore parties recorded receipt and distribution of supplies. Losses due to enemy fire, water damage, and congestion were noted in reports. Salvage operations began on damaged equipment when feasible. By late afternoon, weather conditions improved marginally, aiding visibility and air operations. Sea states moderated slightly, allowing more consistent landing schedules. Tidal changes exposed additional obstacles and debris, requiring renewed clearance efforts. Engineers continued work under intermittent fire, marking hazards and repairing routes. German defensive positions that remained active continued to engage advancing units. Some strongpoints were bypassed when possible, leaving them isolated. Others required direct engagement to secure routes. Fighting occurred at close range in hedgerows, farm buildings, and prepared positions. Reports detailed ammunition expenditure, casualties, and terrain gained or contested. As evening approached, units on both sides adjusted dispositions in anticipation of reduced visibility. Allied units consolidated positions, established defensive perimeters, and prepared for potential counterattacks. Artillery units ashore registered targets and prepared night fire plans. Naval gunfire remained available on call. German units conducted movements under cover of darkness where authorized. Counterattacks were planned or initiated at local levels based on available forces. Communication challenges persisted due to damaged infrastructure and air interdiction. Orders emphasized containment and reconnaissance of enemy positions. Throughout the day, situation reports were compiled at regular intervals. These documents recorded unit locations, strengths, losses, and immediate requirements. Naval action reports logged fire missions, ammunition usage, and observed effects. Air Force mission reports documented sorties flown, targets attacked, and losses incurred. Intelligence summaries aggregated intercepted communications, agent reports, and reconnaissance findings. The events of the afternoon built upon those of the morning without pause. The initial landings had expanded into continuous operations along the coast and inland approaches. The record of the day consisted of sequential entries made under operational conditions, each reflecting the circumstances at the time of writing. The sequence of actions, movements, and engagements continued into the evening hours as forces on both sides adjusted to the evolving situation. As daylight diminished on June 6, 1944, activity along the Normandy coast continued without interruption. Assault forces adjusted dispositions in response to local conditions and orders transmitted during the afternoon. Units ashore focused on securing immediate areas, redistributing personnel, and establishing defensive positions oriented toward likely avenues of approach. Field fortifications were constructed using available tools and materials. Foxholes, shallow trenches, and weapon emplacements were dug into sand, soil, and hedgerow lines. Engineers reinforced positions where time and conditions allowed. Artillery units that had landed earlier in the day completed the assembly of guns and communications equipment. Fire direction centers were established using field maps and survey data prepared in advance. Registration of targets was conducted cautiously to avoid revealing positions unnecessarily. Artillery fire plans were adjusted to reflect current front lines as reported by infantry units. Naval gunfire support remained available during the evening, with ships maintaining stations offshore and coordinating with shore observers when communications permitted. German units in the vicinity of the beachheads reorganized surviving elements following the day's engagements. Casualty collection and redistribution of ammunition were conducted where possible. Defensive positions were reoccupied or relocated based on damage sustained during bombardment and ground fighting. Units reported strength and status through surviving communication links. Where lines were down, messengers were dispatched under cover of darkness. German Higher Command continued to issue directives based on accumulated reports from Normandy and other sectors. Orders emphasized containment of enemy forces and preparation for further action. Reserve movements were coordinated with transportation authorities, subject to air threat and infrastructure condition. Some units reported delays due to damaged roads, destroyed bridges, and fuel shortages. Movement logs recorded start times, halts, and arrival estimates. Air activity persisted into the evening hours. Allied aircraft conducted final sorties before nightfall, targeting transportation routes, assembly areas, and known defensive positions. German anti-aircraft units remained active where ammunition and operational equipment allowed. Night fighters and patrol aircraft prepared for operations after dark. Airfield operations on both sides adjusted to the changing light conditions. On the beaches, unloading operations continued as long as visibility and enemy fire permitted. Shore parties worked to clear debris and maintain access lanes. Supplies were moved inland to reduce congestion and vulnerability. Fuel dumps were dispersed to minimize loss from artillery or air attack. Ration distribution began for units that had been ashore since morning. Water supply arrangements were implemented using containers brought ashore and purification equipment where available. Medical services adapted to nighttime conditions. Casualty clearing stations increased capacity to handle wounded accumulated during the day. Lighting was minimized to reduce visibility to enemy observers. Surgical teams worked continuously as cases arrived. Evacuation schedules were adjusted based on tide and sea state. Medical officers submitted reports detailing numbers treated, evacuated, and remaining. Airborne units inland consolidated positions in anticipation of German counteraction. Patrols were sent out to monitor movement along roads and through villages. Defensive positions were established around key terrain features held since earlier engagements. Communication attempts with seaborne forces continued using radios and signal panels when conditions allowed. Some units remained isolated due to equipment loss or enemy presence. German forces conducted reconnaissance and probing actions during the evening. Small unit movements tested Allied defenses near the perimeter of the beachheads. Firefights occurred intermittently, with limited use of illumination. Reports from these contacts were transmitted upward as conditions allowed. Orders emphasized caution and coordination to avoid friendly fire incidents. Deception measures continued unchanged through the evening and night. Radio networks associated with notional formations maintained traffic volumes consistent with previous days. Transmission patterns adhered to established routines. Dummy installations in England remained in place and guarded. Double agents transmitted routine updates aligned with earlier narratives. German interception and analysis units continued to process this information alongside reports from the Normandy front. As night fell, weather conditions remained variable. Cloud cover increased in some areas, affecting visibility and air operations. Sea conditions stabilized sufficiently to allow continued naval presence offshore. Ships adjusted positions to maintain readiness for fire support and logistical tasks. Crews conducted maintenance and ammunition replenishment where possible. Throughout the night, reports were compiled at regular intervals. Situation reports reflected the status of units, supply levels, and immediate concerns. These documents avoided projections beyond the next operational period and focused on current dispositions. Logs recorded times of events, movements, and engagements as observed. German command posts received night reports indicating continued enemy presence and activity in Normandy. Assessments remained cautious due to limited visibility and incomplete data. Orders emphasized holding actions and readiness for renewed engagement. Coordination between units was challenged by communication disruptions and ongoing air threat. Allied units ashore conducted nighttime security measures. Listening posts were established forward of main positions. Weapons were cleaned and redistributed. Ammunition expenditure was calculated to ensure readiness. Commanders accounted for personnel and adjusted unit organization to reflect losses sustained. Replacement of leaders occurred where casualties had removed command elements. Naval gunfire support plans for the night were maintained on a call basis. Ships monitored communication channels for requests. Fire control teams remained at stations. Illumination rounds were prepared but used sparingly. Coordination with air operations was adjusted to avoid overlap. By midnight, the operational tempo had shifted from continuous movement to localized engagements and consolidation. The day's actions had resulted in established positions along sections of the coast and inland. The records generated during these hours consisted of contemporaneous entries made under operational conditions. Each report reflected the immediate situation without reference to outcomes beyond the present circumstances. The night of 6 to 7 June continued with intermittent activity across the Normandy area. Movements, engagements, and logistical operations proceeded under reduced visibility. The sequence of events recorded during this period formed a continuation of the actions initiated during the first minutes of the landings, extending the operational narrative into the next phase of activity without pause or conclusion. In the early hours of June 7, 1944, activity across the Normandy lodgement areas continued under conditions of limited visibility. Allied units ashore maintained security measures established during the night. Patrols reported sporadic contact with German elements conducting reconnaissance or localized counteraction. These encounters were recorded as brief exchanges of fire, often ending without clear resolution due to darkness and terrain. Artillery units on both sides conducted limited fire missions during the night. Allied artillery fired harassing and defensive fires along suspected approach routes and assembly areas identified during daylight. German artillery responded intermittently when ammunition and communications permitted. Fire was generally unobserved, with corrections based on map references and prior registrations. Logs recorded times, grid references, and estimated expenditure. Naval forces offshore remained on station throughout the night. Ships adjusted positions to account for tidal movement and navigational safety. Damage control parties addressed minor repairs sustained during earlier engagements. Ammunition inventories were checked and replenished from reserve stocks aboard supply vessels when possible. Communication watches remained active, monitoring for fire support requests or emergency signals from shore. At first light, weather conditions were assessed by both sides. Visibility improved gradually, revealing the extent of debris along the beaches. Wrecked landing craft, damaged vehicles, and scattered equipment marked areas of the previous day's fighting. Shore parties resumed clearance operations, removing obstacles that impeded movement and marking hazards exposed by the changing tide. Engineers continued to work on beach exits, reinforcing surfaces to support heavier vehicles. Follow-on landings resumed according to revised schedules. Additional infantry units disembarked alongside artillery, armored vehicles, and logistical elements. Traffic control measures were refined to reduce congestion. Beachmasters coordinated landings using pre-arranged signals, directing craft to available sectors. Unloading priorities remained focused on ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and engineering equipment. Medical evacuation continued at increased scale. Casualties from the previous day and night were moved from inland aid stations to evacuation points near the shore. Hospital ships and transports received wounded as sea conditions allowed. Medical officers recorded diagnoses, treatments, and outcomes in standardized formats. Supplies were redistributed to address shortages identified during the night. Inland, airborne units and seaborne forces attempted to establish contact where operational plans required coordination. Patrols advanced cautiously along designated routes. Some links were made, while others remained incomplete due to terrain, enemy presence, or communication failures. Reports noted successful contacts as well as areas where coordination had not yet been achieved. German units conducted movements during the early morning hours to adjust defensive lines. Elements of reserve formations approached the Normandy area under constraints imposed by air activity and damaged infrastructure. Movement logs recorded delays caused by destroyed bridges, blocked roads, and fuel limitations. Units arriving near the front reported reduced strength due to losses and straggling during movement. German command posts processed updated reports from coastal and inland units. Situation summaries reflected ongoing engagements, estimated enemy strength, and unit dispositions. Orders emphasized containment of beachheads and preparation for further counteraction. Communications remained uneven, with reliance on runners and partial radio links in many areas. Allied air operations resumed with daylight. Fighter patrols provided cover over beachheads and approach routes. Fighter bombers conducted strikes against transportation nodes, troop movements, and artillery positions identified through reconnaissance. Mission reports documented sortie numbers, targets attacked, ordnance expended, and aircraft losses. On the ground, Allied units expanded perimeters incrementally. Engagements occurred at village edges, road junctions, and hedgerow lines. Progress was measured in short advances rather than continuous movement. Engineers cleared mines and booby traps encountered along routes. Units reported ammunition expenditure and requested resupply as stocks diminished. German defensive actions included localized counterattacks aimed at probing Allied positions. These actions were conducted by available infantry elements supported by limited artillery or mortar fire. Engagements were recorded as short-duration actions, often ending when fire support or resistance prevented further movement. Casualties were reported through unit channels. Deception operations remained active throughout June 7. Radio traffic associated with notional formations continued according to established patterns. Transmission volumes and content were maintained to match previous days. Dummy installations in England remained in position. Reports transmitted through controlled agent networks continued to align with earlier narratives. German interception units logged and analyzed this information alongside reports from Normandy. Naval gunfire support continued to play a role in engagements near the coast. Ships responded to requests for fire against observed targets. Fire missions were logged with times, coordinates, and estimated effects. Coordination with air operations was maintained to prevent interference. Ammunition usage was tracked to ensure sustained capability. Logistical operations ashore expanded as supply dumps were moved further inland. Engineers constructed temporary storage areas and access routes. Fuel distribution points were established with dispersion measures. Ration and water distribution continued to stabilize unit sustainment. Losses due to enemy fire and handling were recorded. Throughout the day, situation reports were compiled at regular intervals by Allied and German units. These reports documented unit locations, strengths, casualties, supply status, and immediate requirements. They avoided projections beyond the next operational period. Intelligence summaries incorporated reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and field reports, presenting a composite view of current conditions. By the evening of June 7, operations along the Normandy coast and inland approaches remained ongoing. Positions established during the initial landings had been reinforced and expanded in some areas, while other sectors continued to see active resistance. The records produced during these hours consisted of contemporaneous documentation reflecting observed actions and conditions. The sequence of events, beginning with the first minutes of the landings and continuing through the following day, was preserved in these operational records as a continuous account of movements, engagements, and losses without interruption or commentary beyond the immediate situation.